Hello, this is Laurel Tesch from the Fitchburg Historical Society, welcoming you to our fall 2021 meeting. As a reminder, please keep your video off and your mics muted during the presentation. You will be able to ask questions after the presentation and share any stories about your family tree information. First of all, today's presentation is on using land to map your genealogy. A little bit about myself. I work for the Wisconsin Department of Transportation in Information Technology. I've been active in many technology, community, service, investing, garden, and genealogy organizations. I previously served on the Fitchburg City Council and the Dane County Board of Supervisors. Been a member of the Fitchburg Historical Society for more than 17 years, and I've served as treasurer since 2014. And I've been researching my family for 10 years. And more recently, I've been actively involved in the Dane County Area Genealogical Society, the Wisconsin State Genealogical Society, and the Sun Prairie group, Sun Prairie, Where's Your Roots? And actually, a few years ago, I took an introduction to genealogy class at the Fitchburg Library, and the instructor was Patty Schmitt, and that's how I got to know Patty and started participating in the Sun Prairie group meetings, and have been learning a lot more about Sun Prairie, but in genealogy in general. And Patty retired after 25 years working in public education. She discovered genealogy in high school and then again in college. She's been researching her family for 40 years and as a genealogist for the past 30 years. Patty has worked with the Sun Prairie Public Library for the past 7 years, leading the Sun Prairie Where's Your Roots genealogy group. And the meetings are held on the second Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. via Zoom. You may ask, what is genealogy? Genealogy is learning more about your family's past. And it often requires digging through governmental records, historical archive records, newspaper clippings, other resources that are often hard to track down and may require visits and paying money to get copies of resources. You're really searching for information on births, marriages, migrations, stories, and deaths. Nowadays, genealogy and other online tools make it much easier to search through historical databases and discover old and often obscure facts on your family's history from your computer at your home. And current matching technology can automatically connect your family tree with others who share similar ancestors and even share your DNA. So today's presentation about using land to map your genealogy focuses on something that people may not think about, or you may not think about, as a way to find out more about your family's past. So be sharing a pre-recorded presentation that Patty prepared for us.
Hi, my name is Patty. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about using land to map your genealogy. Now you're probably wondering why we're talking about genealogy and the land and how does that tie together? How does someone owning land help you and I research our family? Well, land records were created. Land records are not just deeds, but they could be property tax records and agricultural records, probate, cemetery records, city and county directories, maps of different types. The further we go back in time, the more likely it is that you and I will find that our ancestors were actually landowners. But as the population in America started increasing in the cities, more people were found to start renting apartments and homes and their store and even a farm. But records were still created. And those records are going to give us clues where to find other information. Those clues help us identify other family members. They can help us identify females. Now remember, the further we go back in time, those first names of females were so difficult to find. We can find possibly our immigrants' origins and their date of immigration, location prior to land ownership. Did they serve in the military? They can help us with those time frames for missing records and the wealth or status of our family. Now, once the Europeans started exploring across the sea, it wasn't surprising, of course, that they came to what is now known as America. Those countries were looking for land because land meant wealth and wealth meant power. Now, Spain, we know, wasn't the first country to come to America, but they were the first ones to claim and establish a permanent colony in what is now known as St. Augustine in Florida. And that happened in 1565. Of course, soon thereafter, we have English came with the Jamestown colony and the Pilgrims and so on and so forth. And you can see by this map of 1650 that we have the English and the French and the Dutch and the Spanish. Now, the Spanish started increasing their territory and moving south and southwest up to the west coast eventually, bringing in their people to colonize. But also said other countries. And then Spain, especially Spain, soon realized that felt that they were being encroached and that they needed to record a system or have a system to record their land claims. They were very good before about documenting their trading and their exploration, but not the land. But they did start because there were many disputes. Now, the earliest records that we have at that time were from what is now New Mexico, and those records are from 1680. But most of the records that Spain did have are after the 1763 date. Now, I wonder, how did our ancestors come about owning land? Well, those European countries, again, granted land to their countrymen. Their countrymen came and spread out so they could claim that land as theirs because their countrymen were there. We know that vital records, birth, marriage, and date, are critical for ancestry research. But so are land records. And they, along with the vital records, are the earliest records to be kept. Now, what does the Spanish land files look like? Well, let's take a look at Florida. Their files contain the name of the original grantee or owner of the property, when they arrived, the amount of land and what improvements were happening on that land, the name of the present owner, a description of the property, under what nation was it granted, what type of claim, the date of ownership, and a surveyor's information. So just how did our ancestors come about owning it? As I've already mentioned, that countrymen were granted land, but there are many different ways. Let's dig a little bit deeper. As our ancestors became landowners, what records can we find? Well, the first place we have land grants. Again, that is government conveyed land to an individual. Grants, again, were given by the authority of the crown or someone who was granted the authority by the crown to give out land. And then we have military bounty land grants. And again, that was for military service. We have a warrant. And now that's the approval of an applicant to a property. And with that came a survey. And there were many different types of survey methods. The mets and bounds were using physical features like swamps, lakes, hills, streams, trees, and a rectangular survey that was used townships, ranges, and sections. And then another term is a patent. And the patent was the first title deed to a property. Now, there are no records that courthouse burned. Yep, courthouses and government buildings certainly did burn. Documents were destroyed. But most importantly, even if a courthouse burned, the owner of the property still had to re-record the property at the courthouse. Your ancestor and mine needed to prove ownership again. So they took that deed or their patent down to the courthouse. Again, had it re-recorded to know that that is theirs, because they certainly didn't want someone coming in and claiming it was their property. Now, if they didn't have that document, they could have someone, a neighbor, for instance, come and give a testament for them. And no offense to anyone who works in government, specifically to the IRS, but there was still taxes due on your property. And the government still needed to know who to ask nicely for their money. Another term is private land claims. A grantee who has to reapply for ownership of land, which they actually acquired by a foreign government or administration, such as that Spain, Mexico, France, or the Dutch. Now, in 1664, Britain was the first to honor previous land claims from a foreign government. 100 years later, Britain again recognized land claims granted by the Spanish government to others. But this time they allowed those people loyal to France, or loyal to Spain, to actually sell their property, or they could pledge loyalty to the British Crown. Now, according to E. Wade Holmes in his book, Land and Property Research in the United States, some of the litigation for private land claims in Florida and the state of Louisiana were still active as of 1960. Now, land could have been given up to 1.5 million acres to a countryman. Now, where am I going to find these records? They can be found at state archives and historical societies, familysearch.org, and at NARA. And in those document files, we're going to find that there's surveys, both by the original foreign country and by America, the length of residence and improvements made to that property, the proof of all title transfers, heirs of each generation that are involved, proof of previous origins and loyalty, political affiliations, witness and claimant statements, and time periods and place of migration. As you can see, there's a wealth of clues in there, a wealth of clues. Now, these files are at the National Archives. They can be researched alphabetically under the General Land Office. Now, Fern Ainsworth compiled several index books, private land claims, and just an FYI, Michigan and Wisconsin are combined into one book. Again, private land claims can be at National Archives and Family Search. Let's talk about bounty land warrants now. Now, originally, King George III proclaimed that each person who served the military duty for His Majesty during the French and Indian War could receive land if they were still residing in America. But he was generous, not only with the amount of land, but he gave them 10 years to make that claim. So if you were a field officer, you could have received 5,000 acres, a captain 3,000, a staff officer 2,000, a non-commissioned officer 200 acres, or a private 50 acres. So what was the process? Well, first, they had in their file, you're going to find a petition or application with a proof of their military service. A warrant was then issued for the land, and then it had to be surveyed and measured. Then a plat map or survey map of the tract with natural landmarks was done. And then finally, that patent, that original deed, was issued to the grantee, and that time they could occupy the land, or they had the choice, they could sell. So within that military bounty file, we can find their service, what age they were when they went in, where they lived prior to military service, the rank, the military unit, how long they served. Now, if the soldier was married and didn't survive, we're going to find out about his widow. That includes proof of their marriage, which will have the date and location, her maiden name, her current residence, and the name of all the children of that said soldier. Now, the military bounty and land grant files can be found at the National Archives, familysearch.org, fold3.com, and Heritage Quest. Let's take a look at one. This is Peter DeWitt. Again, you can see here, Peter was a private from the state of Virginia's 8th Regiment, and he fought in the Revolutionary War. He was awarded 100 acres, and you can see his land warrant number is 5608. Let's take a look at more documents we can find within Peter's file. Again, this is just one of the records that we're going to find in here. And it is actually his pension record, again, stating his rank, where he lived, his commander, his regiment, and the length of service, and that he's getting a pension of $60. Again, within this file, we're going to find a letter written on behalf of Peter DeWitt, who is now 80 years old. He's living in Clark County, Kentucky, and he is requesting, under the act of Congress that was passed in June of 1832, a pension of which we just saw. But he goes on to give us more information. Here's our clues again. He gives his birth date as the 8th of July, 1853, or 1753, excuse me. And he was born in Sussex County, New Jersey. Clues, clues, clues. And it goes on to state when he was 12 years old, he and his father moved to Virginia, specifically Hampshire County. And then he goes on further, and there's many more pages in here about his company commanders and the skirmishes they had. But we've got those clues. He came with his father. It doesn't give his father's name. And it doesn't mention anything about his mother or any other family members. That gives us a clue. Now, again, within this same file for Peter, we find this is just one piece of information. There are three ladies requesting information about Peter. And this is just one, Mrs. Miller. Now, Mrs. Miller goes on and gives us a lot of information. And this is a part of the response from Winifred Scott, and says there's no data on file as to Peter's family other than the reference to his father as mentioned. And the above Peter DeWitt is the only soldier of that name found on the Revolutionary War records of this Bureau. So again, it's really important that we narrow down and we are really solid on our facts, that we know we have the right person. It's so easy to go in a totally different direction. We need to have that really strong fact to go on. And remember, we don't want to have just one piece of information. We need to have as many facts as we can to back up other facts to make sure that we have the right person. But my point is, Winifred and the other two ladies were requesting information because they wish to apply for membership, specifically membership in the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, these are just one of the many, many, many groups that are available for people. There's lineage societies as well. But my point for bringing this up in particular is, in order to join these particular societies, they need to have documentation. Now, should you have an ancestor going back this far to want to join the daughters or sons of one of these, you don't have to recreate the will. You can get some access to some of these documents to be able to tie yourself in. Again, there's all these clues in there to help you. Take advantage. Now, states also use state bounty grants to attract recruits, and specifically for the Revolutionary War. Now, these are the states that did do that: Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, North and South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Each one of these states donated a different amount of land to recruit soldiers for the war, anywhere from 600 acres down to 50 acres. And it all depended on how large of a state they had. Now, I want you to look at this. And should you have relatives that fall within these years of birth, you should definitely look to see if there's any land warrants, bounty land warrants. Now, not all soldiers, again, who applied for land actually went and stayed and got the land, but it does make you want to take a look at that. Now, I do have regular Army in here because up until 1855, any person, any military service member, again, up to 1855, could apply for land. Now, here's the early Virginia families, an abstract for land patents. And it gives us information specifically about William Hawkes. It's very descriptive of the land, those mets and bounds. It talks about from his land goes from the swamp to the river to adjacent to Mr. Park, etc. It also gives us information that he was a planter, and he had, on this particular piece, he had 250 acres. And it gives us his father's name, Henry Dawkes, and his uncle's name, William Lee. Note that his uncle's last name is different. That is a hint. Now, I can go from this and I can look up church records for William. Now, we did not have vital records recorded at a county or state level at this time, but churches were required, as far back as we can go in America, to keep record of certain things: baptisms, marriage, and burials. And so records are still kept, and we are going to look for those records. But I'm also going to look to see what else I can find. And here I find something about his father. And it says his father was an ancient planter, came to Virginia in 1608, and in 1632, his son and heir apparent, William, patented lands due to him for the personal adventure of his father and for the subscription to the stock of the London Company paid for by his father. More clues. And this, as I've mentioned, is one of those mets and bounds. This was the survey map for him. Now, depending upon where when your ancestors arrive, you have the option to possibly see this map. Not everyone has one. And maps help us identify the location of the property that you're seeking. Now, although it may, and it definitely is going to look different from when they originally lived there to now, but you can still kind of get a feel of what it was like for them. You know, is there a lake there where they got their water from, where they washed, where they fished? Did they get ice out of there for preserving their food? Or when their first refrigerator came, did they get the ice for that? Is there a forest nearby where they cut their wood for their home? Using survey maps for its time period may help you, again, understand a little bit what it was like for our ancestors. And that's important. Another way to acquire property was head rights. This was done primarily by England, France, and Spain, and pretty specifically to Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and a little bit in Maryland. So land was given to a family who could purchase their own passage and could remain self-sufficient upon arrival. They received free land. But the cost of a voyage in the 1600s was £6. And for those that could not afford the passage, they could become an indentured servant. They had to serve their master, usually for a term of 5 to 7 years. The master or the sponsor would receive $50, 50 acres for each man, woman, and child that they sponsored. So not only did they get free help, they also acquired land. And yet another way to acquire land was the Homestead Acquisition Act. So let's take a look at that. It encouraged people to head west in the United States. And it was very popular and the easiest way to give out free land. Now, the Homestead Act 16 in 1862 allowed free people that were over the age of 21, the head of a household, a widow or deserted wife to apply, they were granted 160 acres. Now, if they happen to own land somewhere else, the difference would be taken out of that 160 acres. They had to be a citizen, or if they were an illegal citizen, they had to swear that they had never taken up arms or fought against the United States or contribute any way to the enemy. They had to cultivate the land, they had to improve upon the land, and they had to live there continuously for 5 years. So first they had to locate a property. Then they had to file a claim. They had to fulfill those requirements that I just mentioned. Then they had to publish an intent to the claim, just in case someone disputed it. Once that was done, they obtained a final certificate from the land office, and that didn't always come right away. Sometimes it was months or years later. Then they obtained that patent, remember that title, the very first one of that, for the owner of that land. Now it's noted that should the original applicant die, his or her heirs could continue the process and they did not need to start again. The contents of the file included an application. Think of all the information that we will get from that. A document of payments. There were still some payments that were due of fees. It also contained that patent, a declaration of intention or naturalization papers, and the applicant's affidavit. They also have a testimony of a witness about the bounty land. And then if they were a service member, a copy of the Veterans Service Discharge Certificate or any other paperwork related to military service. Now, we're going to take a look at this. We have the name of the original property owner, David Jackson. Now, he was given a patent, so we know he was the original owner, by someone authorized by the president, John Tyler. Information, the original patent, he was probably a soldier. Probably, but not necessarily. He did have a federal patent. It also gives us information here. It gives us the legal description. It gives us when it was dated, 1843, and recorded. Oops, excuse me. It goes on further. It tells us that Mary Ann is David's widow. Mary Ann has remarried. It tells us that David's sole heir is Adelaide. Adelaide is 17 years old, and she is now newly married to Joseph H. Turner. It goes on to say that they originally lived in Prairie View in Waukesha County, Wisconsin. Mary Ann, again, has remarried. She's now Mary Ann Howley. And she gives a dower release to Adelaide. Now, a dower release means that of the original land, as the widow, she can keep up to 1/2 to 1/3 of the property. And she is releasing the land owed to her daughter as the heir. And she, again, says that Adelaide is 17. Now I look and I find that David here gives a much more detailed look when it was issued, statutory reference. Cash sale entries does not necessarily mean that he purchased the property. And here's the legal description. This is found on Ancestry.com. Looking further, I did find it interesting that I find 2 purchases of land, each for 160 acres for Mr. David Jackson. But not everything, the total amount was given to Adelaide. more research would need to be done if I was looking into that family. But it says that the property went from the town of Waukesha to the city of Milwaukee. There is no indication of a Homestead Act, as again, might have been for one of them, given it was 160 acres. But with 320, I would highly doubt that. Now, this is a land grant application from the state of Tennessee, specifically the county of Scott, on the 24th of March, 1851. Michael here, Michael Lowe, is 80 years old. And it states in this application that he was a private. It tells us who his captain was, and he was in the Gorth Regiment of the Tennessee Militia, commanded by Colonel William Gunnell. He was in the War of 1812. Tells us where he was enlisted in Anderson County, Clinton, Anderson County in Tennessee on November 1st, 1814. He was discharged in Mobile, Alabama. He entered November 1st, 1814. He was discharged in Mobile, Alabama, the 1st of April, 1815, after serving 6 months. Now, given that information, I want to look and see what I can find for his military service records. And I find that there are a couple Michael Lowes in here. Interesting, okay? So let's go specifically and see if I can trim it down a little bit more and find my Michael Lowe. And I do find this Michael. This fits with the information given on the original sheet. Again, this is from Ancestry.com. So I am able to go in and look more into Michael's folder. And I can find Michael Lowe here. And I can find more information about Michael. And this is his company muster roll. And now I want to look more. What other records can I find? So I have some dates and I have some locales. So let's see if we can find a census record. And indeed I do. Here we have a man listed as Michael Lowe Sr. in 1830. Now, according to that original land grant for Michael at this time, by my calculations, should be 53 years old. And this census says there was one free man, a male between 1559, that fits, and one free white female aged 49, living in this residence. Again, so far, this fits. Let's look a little further. Let's see if we can find something in the state. So here we have the Tennessee early tax list records. Now this year is 1838, and here we have a Michael Sr. Well, below him we have a Michael, and above him we have a Philip. Could these be his children, his relatives? Definitely needs more research to determine that. But what do we know so far about Michael Sr.? We know a lot. So let's now see if we can find some agricultural records. Again, these are considered land records. Now, this is 1850. At this point, I do not find anything for Michael Sr., but I do for Michael Jr. And I'm just going to use this as an example. The agricultural censuses started in 1850, and they went every 10 years up to 1900. Now, the agricultural census or schedule didn't really change too much until 1880. And I can get a feel just how well off the wealth or status of our Michael Jr. is just by kind of taking a peek to seeing who And who is his neighbors? What does this look like? I see you also need to take into consideration how much land they own too. Now let's take a look at the next census and see the difference. Now, this is the 1880 census, and you can see it's very different. And here's a blank one for 1880. For each, and I suggest you use an extract form like I have here, that you can write down all the information you need to. Now you can print or download these as much as you want. They are free at FamilySearch.org has them, Ancestry has them, and many other places have the free extract forms. Again, you can see there are not that many. Oh, well, I was wrong. There are actually 100 questions on here. And that tells us everything from the crops, cereals, fibers, orchards, everything. It's going to give you a great deal of information. Now, land records also, again, pertain to probate information. Now, in this case, this is Charles. Charles Alexander died on November 14th, 1865 in Waukesha. And we have Mary Ann Alexander, who is the widow of Charles, as it states. And it gives the names of his heirs. He has 7 children, all of the under the age of 21. It tells us the value of his real estate and the land entry information and locale. Now, further in the abstract of this property, it goes on to refer to one of his daughters, Priscilla, where she is now 22 years old and she is married to Maynard, or Franklin Maynard. And she is entitled to 1/7 of the piece of land as rightfully hers. And yet, further along, it also tells us that Mary Ann Alexander, the widow of Charles, has remarried to a Mr. Dana, and she too at this time has passed. Again, a lot of information, especially the names of the children. We have, again, Priscilla and her now husband's name and her married name, as well as her maiden name. Huge. Now, checking the 1860 census, we find that Charles and Mary Alexander were born in England. It gives us an estimate for the time for their birth. Charles around 1826 and Mary around 1830, along again with the location of the births and ages of at this time only 5 of their children. It gives us how much their personal estate was, 3,500, their real estate, the land in particular, 4,000. And it also notes that Charles and Mary have a servant. Again, we're going to compare this to other people during the time period. Was Charles a wealthy man? And I also want you to remember, we're looking for people with the same last name before and after, always in a census record, to see who else might share that same name. Maps. We started looking at ownership maps. Do you notice anything? Yeah, I noticed when I looked on here, similar names of people that were married into a family. Many times land broke apart too, as we saw in previous examples. Priscilla got 1/7 of a piece of land. The land is probably going to be in her husband's name now. People married nearby neighbors. Check your census records for your area. How many different ways can you spell your last name? Hartle, or in my case, Schmitt, or any name. Check it out, spell it out. Now remember, there could have been a language barrier. And the census takers, the farther we go back in time, were sheriffs. They wrote down how they heard things. So one family could have their name spelled many different ways. Keep that in mind always when you do family research. Now, I would suggest that you find a plat map or an owner's map for the area for the time period that your family lived there in that particular area. Look closely. Can you find others, again, with that same last name or close to it? How do you find other relatives? Well, was there a church in close proximity to where your ancestor lived? Remember, at a certain time period, the churches were required to keep certain records. If you were in a community or your ancestors were in a community, a large community that had more than one church of the same faith, please look at the map and look at the church that was closest to your ancestors. That would be the starting spot for you. City and county directories, although I don't have any specific examples for you, are also another wealth of information. Now, I bring this map to you because I want you to know where to look for certain records. Typically, records, once they started being required, are going to be kept in the locality who had jurisdiction at the time. And when I say vital records, I also mean land records too. Now, it's not just the boundaries that have changed over time, but the names of towns, cities, counties, and territories into states even changed. And I'd like you to take a look at the bottom right hand. You'll see RA. And this is a map of 1839. And I've now overlaid the 1850 over the 1839 map. And you can see that there is a change. Part of my father's family came to America in 1839, or it came to Kenosha County specifically in 1839, and they settled in Pleasant Prairie, Kenosha, what is now Pleasant Prairie, excuse me. At that time, though, it was still in Racine County. So any records that I'm seeking for that time period will be in the custody of Racine County. Vital records, again, if they go back that far, which they don't at this time, would be kept there. Land records would be kept in Racine County. Once it splits into Kenosha County, any records, land records or vital records that were created after that, the split, will be kept then in Kenosha County. Now, this is the Department of Interior General Land Office, and I want you to notice this is the first page. I would like you to go at the top under search. And when you're looking for records, you're going to put in information here. Now, I put in Wisconsin. I left the county blank, and I put in the last name Kelly. And what I came up with was this, Patrick Kelly. And I see he has a patent here. And then I go a little bit further. I want to see what other details there are. So I go on and I see more details, and I see kind of, sometimes it can even zoom in. I see that there's a total of 80 acres. Interesting, okay. A cash sale, again, doesn't necessarily mean a cash sale. In this case, it did. Document number, there are more documents within this file. But I also go on to see more results. And I noticed here, there's Kellys, more than one Kelly. I do notice the dates are pretty darn close. 3/3/1843 for John, for Patrick, 3/3/1843, Peter, 3/3/1843. And I noticed they're all very close to each other. I find that very interesting. That is a huge hint to me to continue to look into that. Again, there are related documents in here, other people that will live around there. And I happen to see under Peter Kelly, underneath there, there's a James Quinn, who is also another family member. I can also find the map for them. And I can zoom in and I can find exactly here where their property is located if I want. Bottom line is there are a lot of documents out there, and you need to research. You need to really research. Use land entry books, tract books, deeds, land ownership maps. We need to do due diligence. Excuse me. Just as we check those census records again before and after where we find our ancestor, we need to do the same thing with those land entry books, the tract books, the deeds. We're looking for people, not only our ancestors, but people with the same similar names. Notice people who came in the same vicinity as those Kellys at the same date. They might not have the same last name, but the same date is interesting. That could be a hint. And again, many times our ancestors are living close by to each other. And should a parent pass away, their land was divided by their, possibly to their children. Don't forget the daughter's married and land may be under their husband's last name. Check land ownership maps for the locale and the time period you're seeking. Use all of those hints to find other records. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. I just wanted to, first of all, show some information that I found on Fitchburg-related items. Here's a plat map of Fitchburg from the 1873. And if you notice, like Fitchburg is Township 6 North, Range 9 East. It's one of the ways of designating land in Wisconsin elsewhere. So typically a township was set up as 36 square miles, 6 miles by 6 miles. Each one of these sections is 1 mile by 1 mile. And the numbering system, started from the top right going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then down 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then like 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So in this section 17 is where I'll show you some information in a moment. So like when I went to Bureau of Land Management, General Land Office records, I put in state of Wisconsin, county of Dane, and then township 6, range 9, to see information about land in the town of Fitchburg. And there were like 14 pages of records that showed up here. And down towards the bottom here, there's 3 interesting names. John Stoner, S-T-O-N-E-R, and John Stoner, S-T-O-N-O-R, and another S-T-N-O-R. So even, like with transcribing information in documents, you may come across different name spellings. And here it shows that all 3 parcels were in section 17. Like here, this first one is the west half of the northwest quarter, and then the east half of the northwest quarter, and the west half of the northeast quarter of section 17. So like more specific information, it shows like here, total acres was 80. It was a sale cash entry. And issued December 10th, 1840. And so like here's another view of that information. And then here is a copy of the actual land patent. To all to whom these presents have come greeting, whereas John Stoner of Dane County, Wisconsin Territory, is deposited, and then it goes on from there. So there are, a number uh, of these land patents on some of the former residents of Fitchburg. And then this was another one for the STONOR, again showing 80 acres, and another, and here's the third parcel. All of them were 80 acres. So he had purchased a total of 240 acres. So then, like, that's just another place to give you a start of looking for things, like where your ancestors came from. You may find these types of documents available. And, as Patty had, shared with us today, lots and lots of other information that you can, track down, whether it's looking for information on tax records or like who voted in elections, to just discover like where people lived and where they are connected with your family. Just now wanted to offer opportunity, for anyone who wants to share, experiences about their family history, things that they've discovered, or any questions. And Patty is also available as well.
I have a question for Patty. Your presentation was very good and represented basically the western part of Europe and the peoples that came from the countries that you noted on the map, England, France, and Spain. Is it more difficult to deal with land records from Eastern European travelers?
That's a great question. So I think, to be honest, I haven't had a lot of experience with that. But based on what I do know, the records, we should probably have more records available to us because that time frame was closer than the original European settlers in America, but not necessarily. I think they probably, boy, that is a great question. I wish I had a definite answer to that. But I just don't know. I just can't be certain on that. Sorry about that.
That's okay. The reason I asked is my family is from Eastern Europe, and you talked about people being indentured. A lot of those people became indentured to the farms in the western part of the United States and emigrated backward from there because their original point of entry was New York, but they were shipped immediately to work on farms in the West until their indenture period was over. So the types of records are vastly different, except the church records are the same.
Correct. Yeah. Again, given the time frame, as the closer we got to this time period, or I should say as time goes on, we should have more records for them, much more information for them. It's just a question of finding out, weeding that out, going to the area, if you know where they were, a time period they were, and just work it. Church records are a good place to go. And again, it just really depends on the time frame and the locale and what we can find. And I'm very happy to help you dig through that if you like.
Thank you.
Eddie, I have a question about census records. So,
Sure.
I can find a lot of information for my father's family in particular, going back, a couple of centuries. But when it comes, for example, let's say Village of Oregon, it would say, let's say house number 59. And then the next record might be house number 60. Any ideas on how you can then track back and see what house number 59 actually was in terms of address, for example?
That's a good question. Excellent question. Well, again, they did not necessarily go in order. They were supposed to, of course, again, depending upon the time frame, how far back we're talking about. This was the sheriff that went through and did the census. We could use the Sanborn maps. The Sanborn maps would give us a really good clue because that outlined who lived where, the ownership records. Maps could help us because we can differentiate between neighbors. The last name should be on the maps. And again, we should be able to figure that out by using maps and other sources to do that. And I'm happy to help you once again figure that out too. Good questions. I've never had these before. Very good. Thank you.
The other question I would have has to do with city directories, which can be really helpful and very useful. But are you aware of any good online repository of city directories? I belong to ancestry.com and have the full records, but obviously not every city directory has been uploaded in a shared fashion. So any thoughts of other places to find that sort of information?
I do. Let's see, have you gone to familysearch.org, first of all?
With limited stuff, not a whole lot.
I would suggest starting there.
Okay.
My go-to is always, if you're looking for online records, my go-to is cindyslist.com. That's Cindy with a Y. And Roger probably is shaking his head because I'm always like, if you don't know where to go to Cindy's List for online sources or a way to show you the path to what you're looking for. Let's see, there is the Midwest Genealogy Society, and that is in Indiana. And that has an incredible amount of city and county directories, an incredible amount. If you could get down there or check their catalog and see what they have, that would be great. Now, I do know that they are in the process of going through and having their collections microfilmed. I'm not sure where that is at that process, but I'd also check with your local historical societies, genealogy societies, even your public libraries should have or may have some type of city directories. But familysearch.org if you're looking for online.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Oh, I also wanted to add that city directories aren't limited to only including people, businesses from cities. Because I grew up in Outagamie County in Medina, which is in the town of Dale, and less than 100 people when I grew up there. And so I've been finding a lot of helpful information in the Appleton city directories, which covered many of the rural parts of Outagamie County, which is sort of shocking to me that a city directory would do that. But, so like all the little unincorporated villages, people on the farms, like they're all in there. And I've also found Appleton Public Library having a lot of valuable resources and links to different things as well. I think, Rich, you had something you wanted to share?
Am I muted? The other thing you can do is use the city directories because they have a cross reference. Everything is listed by address, and you can go to your neighbor, and the neighbor might have some information about whatever family you're talking about, and you can do things that that you can't. What do they call it? Cross directory. You can look for other things besides just the person's name. You can go to the address and you can find who lives next door and so on, and that can add a lot of information.
Thank you, Rich. Did you also have something you wanted to share about your family research?
Well, that's the Eggleston part of the family came to America in 1630, and they were Puritans, and they landed at Massachusetts Bay Colony, and a lot has been written about them. And it turns out that that there's a lot of by God Eggleston was the fellow's name. He actually walked 100 miles from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he and his congregation founded Windsor, Connecticut, and they walked on a place of a path called the Connecticut Path, and this is still there, and you can walk it today, and it, you don't have to go anywhere. You can just find it on the internet too. So this is the kind of thing that once you have, in the case of my ancestors, they came to America in 1630, the Egglestons, and what they did was they ended up with a lot of things that they were very prolific as far as lots of the family tree goes. It's a pretty wide. They had huge numbers of kids, and so on, and they're all there. And one tiny little branch of it goes down to my family, but or my immediate family. But they fought on both sides of the Civil War. They did all kinds of things. So it's and they've had books written about them. One of my Confederate ancestors was George Carey Eggleston, who wrote a book called The Rebels' Recollections. And that was serialized in the Atlantic magazine in 1875. And it's still there because the people in 1875 wanted to look back at the recent Civil War, and they wanted both sides. And George Carey was the one who provided the Confederate side of it, which is a little, everybody. And then another one of my, looking way back in this family tree that spreads out, I found out that one of the very early Egglestons in America came and was married. She was married by John Brown, the famous abolitionist. And so this is a way off, but there you can find all this stuff because people have tracked the Eggleston family tree and they've branched out. And that's how I found out all these things, that I was related in very, 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 very remote sense to John Brown, whose body still may be moldering in the grave. So this is and that's the kind of thing that really interests me about genealogy, not so much who, which relative was who and so on, but what they did and how they lived. And that involves not only the genealogy records that you're talking about, but it's the unwritten records. For example, the guys who rode in that dugout canoe that was just unearthed in Lake Mendota 1,200 years ago, they were not keeping records, but they were paddling around Lake Mendota 1,200 years ago, and they were doing what they were doing. This was one of the most prolific or most the place that was most concentrated of Native Americans from like they came up the Mississippi River. They came up and they founded Cahokia, Illinois, near St. Louis. Then they came further and further, and they ended up in the Madison area. This was the Far Lakes was a fertile fishing area, and this was the place where they lived. So here is an unwritten, undocumented, but this was part of our history, part of the history of the land that Roger and Patty were talking about. It goes way back beyond the written records. And that's what really is starting to interest me. Not so much who they, what they wrote down, but what they ate and what they drank, and in some cases what they distilled. This is very much this is how our ancestors really lived, and that's what interests me more than a name on a deed. So there.
Thank you, Rich. Does anyone else have any questions? Anything you wanted to share?
Just say thank you to both you and Patty for doing this. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Yeah, Patty's been a great inspiration for me in genealogy stuff too. So I've learned so much from her in that.